All right, so let's talk about user interface unit testing. So a lot of the concepts that we're going to cover here are common to unit tests in general. Some of the things here are specific to user interface testing. So we'll see which ones are which. But some of the concepts here are also applicable on the middle tier, or if you're using Java, or even if it has nothing to do with human-computer interaction. Right? We did cover a couple of things last week before we left for the break, but I did just want to cover a couple more things that we didn't have a chance. So as the name suggests, unit test means that you want to test the behavior of a component, whether it's rendering something on the user interface, or if it's calculating some complex algorithm. Nevertheless, we want to be able to isolate it from any other dependencies that it might have. Now, these dependencies might be different, whether you are running on the server and you're implemented as Java in the middle tier, or whether you're rendering something on the client using HTML and DOM and whatnot. But nevertheless, the same is true. We want to be able to isolate whatever it is that is being tested from any of the dependencies that might be around it. Okay, some of the dependencies that are common to all unit tests, whether it's server or UI, is one of them is state. We want to isolate it so that it doesn't depend on its state, right? That we can fully control the environment, we can fully control the use case, the state that is that the component under test is using, right? So if we're testing some simple bank account where the state is the balance of that account, then we want to be able to control what the initial state of that account is, right? And be able to say that the initial balance is $100, and that if I deposit $5, the end result is that it's 105. Right? So we want to be able to control the initial state of whatever it is that we're testing. Okay? Other things is that that is also common to either UI or middle tier or otherwise is access to the data, right? Whether that data is accessible through some kind of network or it's accessible through some database access, right? So whatever it is that we're using to access that data, we want to be able to have control over that, right? We don't want to have to be dependent, for instance, that an actual database is actually running, right? That would be just make our test just so much more complex, right? That we actually have to have this database running or this network access actually being there, actual network access, or even the file system, right? That we want to access the data to a file system. So we want to be able to isolate our components from these dependencies, right? And make it behave as if it thought that it really had access to these things, right? That its behavior would be the same. So we want to be able to mock it to a certain level of fidelity, right? That it behaves just the same. So we can focus on testing the behavior, right? And not anything that it depends on. Now, some of the things that are specific to user interfaces, testing user interfaces, is that there'll be presumably the results, whatever the computational results of our component, presumably it will be consumed by some human user, right? By some human eye is going to look at this, is going to parse this visually, right, and say whether this is correct or not, right? Well, we don't yet have artificial intelligence enough that they could replace a human being and actually view something and compare. I guess we do to some extent, but we don't have yet the kind of fidelity where we can just let Tesla deal with this. So the best we could do is perhaps is to look at a calculated DOM, right, and compare it against an expected DOM, right? So we did a little bit of this last week with snapshot testing. I'd like to go a little bit further into this. But basically the fact was that presumably if the DOM was correct, that's the best we could do, right? We could compare it against some expected DOM, whether it's styled correctly, whether it's 5 pixels wide or If it's 3 pixels wide, well, we're not quite yet there yet, right? There's some automations that can do some of this. For instance, next week we'll take a look at some tools that can take a snapshot of a screen, right, and then compare pixel to pixel whether the image is the correct image, right? But let's leave that for next week. But ideally, you would have an actual human being looking at this. So to some extent, we like to be able to remove that dependency of actually having a human being there and looking at this, right? So also, we like to remove the dependency that this is going to be rendered by some framework, maybe a browser or somebody who's parsing the DOM and is rendering this, visually. We like to remove that dependency as well. We did some of that last week using the snapshot test framework that we rendering engine, and also the dependency between components, right? A component being built on top of other components, and so on and so forth. So let's address some of these one at a time.